Welcome to this session of Global Product Management. And in this session, I would like to talk about brand extensions, which is related to product management, and more specifically, tie this with cross-cultural brand extensions, using the concepts that we learned in our previous sessions, the holistic versus analytical thinking styles, and how that is integrated with brand extensions from a cross-cultural perspective. So let's talk about this idea called brand extension. Now, this you may have heard of this concept in the business press. It's a popular strategy that's commonly used by many product and service companies around the world. And basically, brand extension means that the definition of brand extension is that a company expands into a different product category from what it's currently doing. So it's engaging in a business, it's entering into a product or service category that is different from its current product or service category. And that's what brand extension means. So just to give you an example, I think an example that we can all know. Let's just assume that if Toyota or Honda or Nissan, these are automobile companies from Japan, and we know that they make cars, and Honda makes motorcycles, and they make some other machinery that has engines that uses small engines like lawnmowers and stuff like that. But if Honda started making, let's say, bicycles, if they enter the bicycle industry, that's something that they're currently not doing, and it's in a totally different product category. It's kind of related because it has wheels. It's a transportation vehicle. Then that would be an example of a brand extension. So, like I said, if a company expands and enters into a product category that is different, and that key word here is different. To what extent? Right? I mean, it could be very different. It could be moderately different. It could be fairly similar. So we're going to talk more about this later on. But for now, I think that suffice. But that's what we mean by brand extension, when it expands and enters into a product category that is dissimilar, that is different from the product or service category that it's currently doing business in. So, what is the underlying mechanism, right, of brand extension? Because at the end of the day, the reason why brand extension is important because it all has to do with how consumers perceive a company's initiative to engage in brand extension. So if a company expands into a different product category that's dissimilar from what it's currently doing, how is that received by customers? Do they evaluate that positively? Do they evaluate that negatively, or are they indifferent? I mean, these are very, very important strategic decisions because it costs a lot of money for a company to engage in a brand extension, and they want to have a fairly good idea of whether this makes sense to customers before they embark on this, investment, this, major decision. So the underlying mechanism of brand extension, it really can be explained from a consumer psychology perspective. In a nutshell, it's a categorization process. From a consumer's perspective, it's a categorization process. Consumers categorize. In other words, they put these into different buckets, so to speak. Categorization. So does that make they assess the evaluation. They assess the goodness of fit, basically, which we'll talk about shortly. So it's a categorization process in which the new product is judged according to the suitability of its membership in a category, or what we can call perceived fit, right? that already contains a product or a set of products and that has some brand name as its identifiable label. So customers will assess and evaluate the perceived fit between the expanded product in that new product category versus the core, the established product category that they're currently doing business in. And when they assess that the perceived fit is good, then that's a good thing. That means that there's a greater chance and likelihood that customers will evaluate this brand extension favorably. Whereas if they perceive the fit as misfit, it's not a good fit. If Honda goes into beverages, let's say, carbonated soft drinks, I mean, that's very, very dissimilar. For most people, there's no similarity. People will have a hard time understanding, what are they thinking? I mean, they can't find any logical link in terms of perceived fit. Then, they'll probably, in most cases, they'll perceive the fit as in a negative way. So it depends on the perceived fit. So the benefits and affect associated with this brand category may transfer to an extension when consumers perceive the extension as fitting with the brand category. So basically, the company is expecting a transfer. It's like a positive contagious effect that, if there's a positive belief or an affect or an emotion that customers affiliate and associate with the current product category, and they extend it into a different product category, the expectation from the company is that they want that goodwill, so to speak, or that affect and emotion that they've established in that product category to be transferred, to be contagious in a good way to the expanded product category. So like I said, it really boils down to goodness of fit. Right? And goodness of fit can be thought of from two different perspectives. The first is product feature similarity. The second is brand concept consistency. So what do we mean by these two different types of goodness of fit? Product feature similarity is more of a categorization type of idea. In other words, as the label implies, the word implies, it's comparing feature similarities between the current product category that they're in versus the new expanded product category. So do they see any overlapping features that are similar? The more similar they are, like the example that I gave you, car versus bicycles, I mean, these are pretty similar. I mean, they have wheels. It's a moving vehicle, although one is less complex than the other. There is some similarity, and most people can relate to that. So that would be assessing goodness of fit from a product feature similarity. Whereas brand concept consistency does not necessarily imply objective product feature similarity, but this concept is more along the lines of whether there is brand concept that overlaps, that is consistent between the current product category and the extended product category. So the brand concept consistency implies that, from a product feature similarity perspective, the extended product category may be fairly dissimilar to the current product category, but as long as the brand image or the brand concept is consistent and similar, this is more of an abstract idea, as you can see now. It's more about the image, right? The concept. Then people may think, hey, that's okay. Because they can relate to that. So let's dig this a little bit deeper and let's look at the product feature similarity, the goodness of fit from a product feature similarity perspective. So prior brand extension research has conceptualized and measured perceived fit as a function of product similarity judgments in which consumers compare some aspects of the existing set of products with those of the extension product. So, like I said, it's more of a physical product feature comparison, and hence it is consistent with this idea of object categorization process. It's more of a simple categorization process. So, a positive relationship between product feature similarity and consumers' evaluations, purchase intentions, and sales of and brand extensions can be expected. Moving on to this next notion of goodness of fit, which is the brand concept consistency idea. This notion, can be, defined as whether an extension product is often seen as consistent with the brand concept depends on how readily it can accommodate a certain brand name, concept, or an image. This readiness, in turn, depends on consumers' perceptions of whether the brand concept associations, such as status, reliability, image, like I said, are potentially relevant or desirable in connection with a particular product. So, let me give you this example of, Porsche and Ferrari. So we all know that, Ferrari and Porsche, they make high-end sports cars. But we also know that Porsche and Ferrari make and sell men's fashion apparel, accessories, sunglasses, luggages, suitcases, briefcases, shoes, and so forth. So if you look at it from a product feature similarity perspective, a brand that makes cars, sports, high-end luxuries, high-end sports cars, and men's fashion apparel and accessories, there's nothing really in common. I mean, one is in the sports automotive industry product category. The other is more in the men's fashion product accessory category. There is very little overlap, and there is no product feature similarity. However, it's very successful. People can relate to this. Why? Because there is a brand concept consistency that spills over from the masculine high-end luxury image that Porsche and Ferrari has to these fashionable apparel and accessories that they sell for men. So there is an overlap of the status, of the image, of what it's trying to portray in the market, and people buy into this brand concept consistency. So integrating, combining what I've just said, this brand extension model shows you two different ways that brand extensions can work. And if we go ground up, going from bottom to the top, on the left-hand side, you will see the left-hand side shows you product feature similarity, how brand extension is evaluated and conceptualized from a product feature similarity perspective, whereas the right-hand side shows you how brand extension is conceptualized and evaluated from a brand concept consistency perspective. So both can work. And it really depends on what the firm wants to do and which type of brand extension model that they want to apply to their product category expansion strategies. So the big idea is that consumers perceive greater fit between a brand and the extensions when the extensions share the same concept as the brand than when they do not. So again, this is the idea of this brand concept consistency idea. Now, having said all of this, let's take all of this, let's try to absorb all of this, and let's try to apply this in a cross-cultural setting. So let's look at cultural differences in brand extension evaluations, the influence of analytic versus holistic thinking. So in our previous sessions, we discussed this notion of analytic versus holistic thinking, how, people from different parts of the world, whether you come from the Far East versus the West, typically we said the people in the Far East have a more of a holistic thinking style. People from the West have a more analytical thinking style. And we're going to use what we learned in the past, in the previous sessions, and apply that and integrate that with brand extensions so that we can, have a holistic, a more of a synthesized view of how these two sort of parallel concepts can be merged to provide more insight in the practical world. So, cross-cultural brand extension. All right, so the idea is, now that we know what brand extensions are, can there be differences, from consumers that come from different cultures in terms of how they view and evaluate and assess brand extensions? Now, that's the big idea behind, what I'm trying to communicate in this session, at least this part of the slide deck. So consumers from different cultures, they may vary in their evaluations of brand extensions, and they may vary because of the different thinking styles, the analytic versus the holistic thinking style. So that's what we're going to get into, and that was the notion of the articles that that were on the reading list. So, cross-cultural brand extensions. Research suggests that U.S. consumers place more emphasis on brand extension fit than consumers from Hong Kong. So we're using U.S. consumers as an example of the West, and Hong Kong consumers as an example from the East, who rely on, so U.S. consumers place more emphasis on brand extension fit than to consumers from Hong Kong who rely on corporate reputation. Or alternatively, extension fit may be more important, maybe important across cultures, but there may be cross-cultural differences in the way extension fit is evaluated and judged. So that really gets to the core of what we're trying to examine here. So let's look at holistic thinking and brand extensions. So consumers from Eastern cultures, a good example is from most consumers from Asia, will perceive a higher degree of brand extension fit than those from Western cultures, especially for extensions in product categories far from those associated with the parent brand. Brand extensions viewed as being far away from the domain of the parent brand could be viewed as a better fit if consumers were able to link them on a more holistic basis. So the idea behind this is saying that when the brand extension is far from the parent brand, in other words, very different from what they're currently in, the product category that they're currently in, the more dissimilar they are, the further they are apart, that may pay off more, or it may be viewed more favorably from consumers that engage in a holistic thinking style than those that engage in an analytical thinking style. So that's the crux of this slide and the idea behind what we're trying to communicate here. So consumers who engage in holistic thinking may view brand extensions that are far or dissimilar in a more favorable manner than consumers that engage in analytical thinking. So we're going to see all this. I'm going to show you some data that examines this. So the hypotheses that we're trying to test and show is that H1, consumers from Eastern cultures will perceive a higher degree of brand extension fit than consumers from Western cultures in general. Therefore, if they perceive a higher degree of fit, then, as stated in H2, that should suggest that consumers from Eastern cultures will evaluate brand extensions more favorably than consumers from Western cultures. So I obviously, as you can see, H1 and H2 are related, because if they perceive better fit, goodness of fit, then that's going to logically, relate to, a more favorable evaluation of the brand extension, which is what H2 is stating. So this is from, this table is from from the readings. And let me just briefly show you what we're talking about, or what the results are shown in this table here. So we have 4 different types of fit. Very low fit, going from left to right, we have very low fit, moderate fit, and then high fit. And then we have 2 different types of brands, Kodak and McDonald's. So let's look at Kodak first, and then we'll talk about McDonald's. So Kodak, we know that, it used to be a company that makes, digital cameras, film, it's in all this digital photography business, it was. So having said that, then most people know that. So a very low fit, so a brand extension that would be considered a very low fit would be if Kodak went into the shoes industry, right? For most people, that would not make that much sense. That would be, or it would consider a very low fit. Compare that with low fit, which is not as, dissimilar, but it's still dissimilar in the sense that if they started, making filing cabinets. And then example of a moderate fit would be if they started, a business in the cards industry, like birthday cards or whatever cards industry. So these 3 examples show you, the products that range from very low fit to moderate fit. And then we have U.S. consumers and Indian consumers. So U.S. consumers would be example of consumers who engage in analytical thinking. Indian consumers would be an example of consumers that engage in more of a holistic thinking. But as you can see now, let's just look at, let's look at Kodak and fit across shoes, filing cabinet, and cards. As you will see, so the higher the number, ignore the numbers in the parentheses, just look at the numbers above the parentheses. As you will see, these range from 1 to 7. So the higher the number, the greater the fit, and the better the evaluation. So across the board, going from left to right, you will see that Indian consumers evaluate fit and evaluation more favorably, higher than U.S. consumers. And that pattern is consistent across the board, from very low fit to moderate fit. They're all higher. So what is that showing? That's showing that Indian consumers who engage in holistic thinking have a more positive evaluation and have a more positive fit assessment than U.S. consumers who engage in analytical thinking. Moving on to McDonald's now. The only difference between McDonald's and Kodak is that for McDonald's, we've added high fit. So we all know what McDonald's is, but let's say that, so an example of a high fit would be onion rings. Moderate fit would be omelet. Low fit would be chocolate bars. Very low fit would be razors, right? So if you look at high fit, and if you compare U.S. consumers versus Indian consumers, you will see that in the case of high fit, there's not much difference. Statistically, they're exactly the same in terms of fit assessment and the extension evaluations. So what is this saying? This is saying that the stark contrast or the difference between holistic thinkers versus analytical thinkers, that difference disappears or is not present when the brand extension is a high fit. Whereas that difference between the 2 thinking styles is more pronounced the lower the fit. So that's an interesting phenomenon. When there's high fit, there is no difference between analytical thinkers and holistic thinkers. They're very similar, as you can see. 6.32 versus 6.3, that's basically the 0.06 difference. 4.84, again, 0.06 difference. That's statistically equivalent. Whereas the more you move from right to left, from high fit to very low fit, the greater the difference, the more pronounced the difference between these two different thinking styles. So that's an interesting observation and results that we get. So some of the thought responses in terms of how consumers arrived at these decisions is interesting if we look at these. So for example, responding to the Kodak filing cabinet, Americans commented that Kodak making a filing cabinet was odd and it had nothing to do with photography. So if you're very logical, based on feature similarity, that's a reasonable response. I mean, most people can maybe relate to that. Consistent with an analytical thinking based on product, class similarity. However, for Indians, as you can see, they thought in a slightly different way. In contrast, responded that a filing cabinet could be used to store Kodak pictures. And Kodak products are some of the best in the market, so filing cabinets would be the same. So as you can see, they're looking more at relationships, linkages, as opposed to a simple categorization. That's different from the Americans who are more analytical. So this is consistent with holistic thinking about how the extension could be related to Kodak's other products. Moving on to the example of McDonald's. For McDonald's chocolate bar, Americans disparaged the product, saying McDonald's is into fast food, not candy and greasy, grimy chocolates. So this is how Americans sort of defended and arrived at their decisions in the way that they did. In contrast, the Indians noted that it would be liked by children and makes sense because chocolate would be an inexpensive addition to their dessert menu. So as you can see, the same brand extension, the chocolate bar, depending on whether you're an American or an Indian, is viewed very, very differently. And this has significant implications for companies that are trying to expand overseas. So one, takeaway that you can imagine from all of this is that if you are a global company and you want to engage in a brand extension, you want to expand into a very different product category that is very different from what you're currently doing, at least according to the data and what we've learned so far, is that the chances are that it's going to be, received in a more favorable manner will be in a market that is dominated by holistic thinkers, which would be, Asia and the Asian market, as opposed to the North American market or the European market. Whereas if you're engaging in a brand extension that is fairly similar to what you are doing, then it really doesn't matter where you're, like we said, when it was high fit, there was no difference between analytical thinkers versus holistic thinkers. So again, this sort of has priority setting in terms of how you're going to allocate your resources, or it may have impact on the sequence or the order in which you launch your new products globally. So the more dissimilar the brand extension product category is, the better chance that you're probably going to have if it's launched in a market where the consumers are more holistic thinkers versus analytical thinkers. Whereas if the brand extension is in a product category that is fairly similar, then it's irrelevant. It really doesn't matter. So hypotheses. 3, priming holistic thinking among Westerners. Priming means making them think in a certain way. Priming holistic thinking among Westerners will increase perceptions of brand extension fit and extension evaluations. So we know that Westerners are more analytical thinkers. But if we can make a way, if we can find a way to, enable Westerners to think in a holistic way, which is sort of contrary to their natural way of thinking, then this hypothesis 3 is saying that that's going to lead to a higher perception of brand extensions if we're able to make them think holistically. Conversely, priming analytical thinking among Easterners who are inherently more, holistic thinkers will decrease perceptions of brand extension fit and extension evaluation. So what this hypothesis is trying to show is that if there's a way that we could change how people think in ways that are different from their natural way of thinking, their inherent tendency of thinking, then, we can maybe, sort of move people in the direction that favors how we want them to think, that will help our company. So that's what H3 is trying to get at. So this graph kind of shows you the results for H3. So here we have the solid line is Caucasian Americans, the dotted line is Indian Americans, and on the x-axis we have two situations where we didn't prime, that's no prime, and then the one on the right is where we primed them. We kind of forced them. We made them think in a certain way. In other words, we made Indians think in an analytical way, and we made Americans think in a holistic way. So as you can see, look at the solid line. It's increasing. It has a positive slope. In other words, these Caucasian Americans had the evaluations of fit, the goodness of fit, increased when they were primed to think in a holistic way, which is different from their natural way of thinking analytically, which would be the case for no prime. Whereas the reverse is true for the dotted line, which shows the case of the Indian Americans. Indian Americans, it's downward sloping in the sense that the goodness of fit assessment diminished when they were primed to think in an analytical way, which is the opposite of how they would naturally think, which is more in a holistic way, which shows you the case for no prime. Or another way of thinking, of interpreting this graph is that if you look at the 4.67 and the 4.42, they're fairly similar, as is 3.00 versus 3.21. In other words, this shows you the case where Caucasian Americans that think holistically, which is the 4.42, is fairly similar to how the Indian Americans would think naturally under the no prime condition, which is more in an analytical way. So making certain customers think in a certain way, in this case, Americans thinking in a holistic way, can lead to outcomes that are fairly similar to Indian consumers who inherently think in a very analytical way. And the same thing goes for if you compare the 3.0 versus the 3.21. And then the same results, I won't go into the detail here because all that's different here is if you look at the y-axis, in the previous graph, it was fit, goodness of fit. Here, the y-axis label is brand extension evaluation. So, they're correlated, obviously. I mean, if people perceive a higher goodness of fit, that's going to lead to a higher brand extension evaluation. And as you can see, the pattern of the graphs are exactly the same as we saw in the previous slide. So the results are very consistent, regardless of whether the y-axis is evaluations, brand extension evaluations, or goodness of fit. So what's the conclusion? The conclusion is that consumers from Eastern cultures perceive higher levels of brand extension fit and evaluate brand extensions more favorably than do consumers from Western cultures. We just saw that. These differences are robust for extensions that range from only very low to moderate, but not high fit. So if you go back to that, recall that table where we showed you the Kodak, or the McDonald's example, I should say, the McDonald's example where the high fit, in the case of the high fit, there was no difference between the analytical thinkers versus the holistic thinkers, whereas, the difference was very, pronounced in the case of very low fit to moderate fit. So as I said before, when there's high fit, there's no difference. Priming holistic thinking in Westerners resulted in higher perceptions of brand extension fit and more favorable extension evaluations. We just saw that in that graph where they crossed each other, in the sense that when you made Americans think in a holistic way, that led to higher evaluations of brand extensions. And similarly, priming analytical thinking in Easterners had just the opposite. So when you primed Indians to think in an analytical way, then that led to a diminished fit and brand extension evaluations. And that's why you saw that graph, the dotted graph, had a negative slope pointing downwards when Indians were primed in an analytical way. Further, cultural differences in extension fit perceptions and extension evaluation disappeared when Easterners and Westerners were primed to think in the same way, either holistically or analytically. Like I just said, I was explaining in that previous, graph there, comparing that 4.0 to 4 point something, I can't recall exactly what those numbers were, but when you compare, Americans to think holistically versus Indians who naturally thought holistically, the goodness of fit assessments and the brand extension evaluations were fairly similar. So then it disappeared. Okay, let's move on to our last topic, and this has to do with firm size and brand extension, a cross-cultural perspective. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to discuss how firm size comes into the picture. What is the influence of firm size on brand extensions, and how does that differ depending on cultures? So U.S. firms in general seem to rely primarily on the product-related benefits or images of their products when providing brand extensions, whereas East Asian firms seem to focus on corporate equity or reputation. So U.S. firms versus Asian firms, they emphasize and underscore different aspects when they engage in brand extensions. One, they emphasize more of the product-related benefits or the images. The other, more on corporate firm equity and the reputation that they have in the market. So let's look at some of these hypotheses, and I'll show you some data that test these hypotheses to get my point across. So if you look at H1, in a collectivist society such as in the Far East, company size affects perceived quality ratings of an extension when the perceived fit between the extension category and the core category is low. However, company size does not affect perceived quality in the case of high fit. So what does that mean? That means that in a more of a collectivist Asian society market, company size influences how consumers assess brand extensions only when the brand extension is low, when the fit is low. When the brand extension fit is high, company size does not come into the picture and has no role. That's what H1 is asserting. Compare that to H2. In an individualistic society, such as the West, the US, or North America, or in Western Europe, the degree of fit between the extension category and the core category affects the perceived quality ratings of an extension, not company size. So H2 is saying that company size is irrelevant, regardless of the perceived fit, whether it is very low fit or high fit. It does not matter. Company size does not come into the picture at all. Whereas in a collectivist society, as stated in H1, company size does matter, but it only matters when it is low fit. In the case of high fit, it does not matter. So let's look at some data to see if these expectations pan out. So this is study one, and these results come from your readings in the article as well. But this is from Hong Kong, consumers from Hong Kong. And we have different parent categories. So ice cream, automobile, banks. We have three different product and service categories. I guess banks with service category. And then we have perceived fit, range, that's low fit versus high fit. And then we have the size of the company, that's small versus large. Now, if you look at, let's just pick an example. Let's look at automobiles. So for automobiles, when the extension is high fit, when the customers perceive the extension to be high fit, the size of the company, whether it's small or large, does not matter. If you compare 4.00 versus 3.87, I mean, there is a difference, but that difference is statistically non-significant. In other words, they're basically the same. However, if you look at when the perceived fit is low, then company size does matter. In other words, Hong Kong consumers perceive that the fit is better when the size of the company is big versus small, 3.77 versus 2.71. That's where you see that asterisk next to 3.77. That means that 3.77 is statistically greater than 2.71. So what is this saying? And you can see that pattern is consistent for ice cream, for automobiles, and for banks. So what does this imply? This implies that when the perceived fit is high for consumers from Hong Kong, company size does not matter. Whereas when the perceived fit is low, company size does matter. And perceived fit or the brand extension is viewed more favorably when the company size is large compared to small. In other words, the bigger the company, the more benefit of the doubt that consumers from Hong Kong are going to give, especially or only when the perceived fit is low. Whereas when it's high, company size, they don't care about company size. So this is very consistent with hypothesis 1, H1. Now, compare this to U.S. consumers. If you look at U.S. consumers, as you can see, let's stick with this automobile, product category. When the perceived fit is high, 4.79 versus 5.05, there's no difference, which is what we saw from the Hong Kong example. However, when the perceived fit is low, unlike the Hong Kong example, here, again, just like it was for the perceived fit high case, there is no difference, 3.15 and 3.55. Although 3.55 is higher than 3.15, statistically, they're the same. There's no asterisk, next to 3.55, although it's bigger than 3.15, which implies that company size does not come into the picture and has no role, regardless of whether the perceived fit is high or low for U.S. consumers. Whereas for Hong Kong consumers, when the perceived fit is low, it does matter. So that's an interesting phenomenon. That's an interesting observation, that people from the Far East, for some reason, whatever that may be, which I'll show you shortly, they give more benefit of the doubt to larger, bigger companies when the perceived fit is low, when the brand extension perceived fit is low. However, for U.S. consumers, we do not see that phenomenon. Now, let's move on and try to address why is this happening? Why do we see what we just saw in study one between, well, where's the difference coming from between Hong Kong consumers and US consumers? That's what study two gets at. So study two, we add one more idea, concept to this, which is perceived risk. Could it be the case that for Hong Kong consumers, when the perceived fit is low and they give more favorable evaluations to bigger companies, it's because Hong Kong consumers sense lower levels of perceived risk for a larger company that's engaging in a brand extension that has low fit. Whereas for US consumers, maybe there is no difference in the level of perceived risk between a large company and a small company, at least not to the extent to where it leads to any differences in levels of assessment and brand extensions. So let's take a look for Hong Kong consumers first, and then we'll look at US consumers. So here we have ice cream, beer, and toothpaste. So let's look at beer. So here, if you look at the beer extension and you look at quality, that's exactly what we saw from study one. So I'm not going to focus on quality. I'm going to focus on the perceived risk. So if you look at when the perceived fit is high for beer extensions, the level of perceived risk between a small company and a large company is identical. In other words, 2.67 versus 2.13, although people perceive a slightly less risk for larger companies than for small companies, when the perceived fit is high, that difference between 2.67 and 2.13 is not statistically significant. However, look what happens when the perceived fit is low. Consumers from Hong Kong perceive a significant amount of less risk when the company is large, 2.53, compared to a company that is small, 4.33. So maybe it seems like it's the case that for Hong Kong consumers, they just simply perceive less amount of risk from brand extensions that are low fit that come from larger companies compared to smaller companies. But now look at what happens for US consumers. Continuing on with the beer example, there is no difference between small companies and large companies in the amount of perceived risk, whether it is high perceived fit versus low perceived fit. In other words, unlike Hong Kong consumers that have a mitigated level of perceived risk for for bigger companies compared to smaller companies, in the case of low perceived fit, that does not happen for US consumers. US consumers perceive the very similar amounts of perceived risk, regardless of the company's size, between high versus low perceived fit, which is a very interesting phenomenon. So I'm going to end this session with the case of a brand that comes from Japan, Shiseido. This is a cosmetic brand from Japan. It's a popular brand in Japan. They sell this brand in the US. If you go to department stores, you can find Shiseido in the cosmetic section of department stores. But the reason why we're using this example is because Shiseido is they're in the cosmetic business. But in Japan, they expanded into the diaper, children diaper, baby diaper business. And it was received very favorably. So having, gained some momentum, they thought, let's try to enter the US market and let's again launch diapers baby diapers in the U.S. market. What happened was that it failed. So unlike the U.S. market, unlike the Japanese market, in the U.S. market, the baby diaper product category was not viewed as favorably as Japanese consumers in their local market. Now, there's many ways to explain why that may be the case, but based on at least what we've learned in this session, it may be the case that, consumers engaged in different type of thinking. U.S. consumers are more analytical thinkers, whereas Japanese consumers are more holistic thinkers. Therefore, based on what we learned, people who engage in holistic thinking are more receptive or give more positive evaluations for a brand extension that is fairly different and dissimilar to their core product category, which was the case of Shiseido, expanding into the baby diaper industry from their core business of the cosmetic industry. So this example just goes to show you how different brand extensions can be received and viewed and assessed very differently in different cultures of the world, depending on how consumers engage in different types of thinking. So thank you. And that comes to our conclusion of product management, global product management from a brand extension and cross-cultural perspective. Thank you.